This is the final step, Valentina.
You'll be back, Valentina.
Before we begin, I have a small request for you. I'm currently striving to hit the 1000 subscriber mark, a number that holds a very special significance for me. Please hit that subscribe button. It's a simple click, but it's a massive source of motivation for me to create the next video. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Ella signed the divorce papers in silence, and her billionaire father changed everything. Sign here, Valentina, or I swear I'll make it so difficult you won't even have the clothes on your back. Rodrigo Montiel said it quietly, with the calm of a man who never needed to shout because money shouted for him. He said it leaning slightly over the polished mahogany table of Monterrey's most exclusive family court, adjusting his gold cufflinks as if what he had just uttered was a courtesy, not a threat. And he smiled. That smile of his that Valentina had learned to hate with surgical precision over 8 years of marriage. She didn't look at him. She picked up the pen. A black fountain pen that Rodrigo's lawyer had strategically placed in front of her, as if even that small gesture were part of the show. And she began to read the document with a slowness that made the jaw of the man, who had once sworn eternal love to her in front of 200 guests at the Metropolitan Cathedral, clench. Family Court Number 4 of the San Pedro Garza Garcia Judicial District was unlike what one might expect from a government building. It was a place of travertine marble, high ceilings, and natural light that entered obliquely and golden through 2-meter-high windows. It was the kind of courthouse where the rich got divorced without being forced to share a waiting room with the ordinary world. Rodrigo had chosen it himself, as he chose everything. Seated before the letterhead sheets, Valentina Vega de Montiel, as the document still read, that borrowed surname that would soon disappear from her name, like a stain that finally yields to soap. She looked extraordinarily serene for a woman about to sign the end of her life as she had known it. She wore a simple, unadorned cream-colored tailored dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except for small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She hadn't put on much makeup. She had chosen every detail of that attire with the same deliberation with which a general chooses the battlefield. She wanted to look serene. She wanted Rodrigo to look at her and find nothing he could interpret as defeat. To her right was Licenciada Fuentes, her lawyer, a small woman with black hair and eyes that didn't blink enough, who had spent the last 3 weeks preparing her for this moment with a mixture of professional coolness and contained compassion, which Valentina had appreciated more than she could express. It's 16 pages, Licenciada Fuentes murmured into Valentina's ear. You can take all the time you need. I can read, Valentina replied, also in a very low voice. On the other side of the long table, Rodrigo Montiel waited with the posture of someone accustomed to making others wait for him. 49 years old, dark hair, slicked back with discreet gel, a custom-made black suit that must have cost what an employee of his company earned in 6 months. He was still an attractive man, in that way certain powerful men are, whose attraction comes not from their physique, but from the absolute certainty with which they move through the world. He was the type of man who never asked permission to enter anywhere, who always arrived just in time because he managed his own time, who, when he spoke, people listened even if they didn't want to. 8 years ago, Valentina had believed that security was strength. It took her exactly 2 years to understand that it was something completely different. Beside him was Licenciado Garza Trevino, Nuevo Leon's best matrimonial lawyer, with a wine-colored tie and a $2 watch, who had structured the divorce agreement with the precision of an expert butcher. Valentina would receive the Cumbres apartment, not the house in San Pedro, not the beach house in Acapulco, not the cabin in Valle de Bravo, and a monthly pension for 3 years, which, although generous in absolute terms, represented less than 1% of the value of the Montiel consolidated assets. Valentina had reviewed everything with Licenciada Fuentes. She knew exactly what was hers and what wasn't, and she had made a decision that her lawyer didn't quite understand, that had made her frown and ask twice if she was sure. Why aren't we fighting for more? Licenciada Fuentes had asked in their last private meeting. With what we have, we could ask for at least 40% of the marital assets. There are precedents. I don't want anything from him, Valentina had replied. I just want to leave. And now she was there, reading the 16 pages calmly, without haste, while Rodrigo checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. And Licenciado Garza Trevino scribbled something in his notebook, with the bored expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. Valentina reached clause 14, read it twice, then closed her eyes for a second, just one, and opened them again. Any questions? Asked Licenciado Garza Trevino, with that barely disguised condescension he had perfected over decades of dealing with women he considered, deep down, secondary characters in his male client's dramas. None, said Valentina. She uncapped the pen and signed. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There was no tremor in her hand. There was no contemplative pause. There was no last long look at her soon-to-be ex-husband. She signed with the same efficiency with which one signs a package delivery slip, page by page, in each designated space, without skipping any, without making a mistake on any. When she finished, she placed the pen on the table softly and clasped her hands in her lap. Done, she said. Rodrigo watched her for a moment with something Valentina couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was something more complicated, something akin to the irritation a man feels when he wins too easily, and suspects that perhaps the game wasn't what he thought. How efficient, he said finally with that half-smile. I learned from the best, Valentina replied. She stood up, picked up her purse, a small brown leather bag, no visible brand, unpretentious, and waited for Licenciada Fuentes to gather her documents. The court clerk collected the signed papers. The judge, a man with a gray mustache, who had presided over the proceedings with the same neutral expression he would have had for reviewing a lease agreement, made a notation in his file. The marital bond is dissolved, said the judge without any particular inflection. The session is adjourned. Valentina nodded as if she had just heard the weather forecast. She walked towards the door without looking back. It was Rodrigo who spoke first when she already had her hand on the dark wood and frosted glass doorframe. He said it without standing up, without raising his voice, with the ease of someone who knows he can afford cruelty, because no one in that room would question him. Hey, Valentina, she stopped, but didn't turn around. I always knew you were nobody, he said. Just a pretty face who got lucky that I noticed her. I hope the Cumbres apartment is enough for you to live on, because without my surname, you are absolutely nothing in this city. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Valentina counted them, then pushed the door open and stepped out. Outside, in the marble corridor that smelled of pine and old documents, Licenciada Fuentes caught up with her heels clicking on the polished floor. Are you okay? She asked quietly, with the discretion of someone who knows that in these hallways the walls hear perfectly. Yes, said Valentina, and it was true, or something very close to it, because what she felt at that moment wasn't exactly pain nor relief. It was something more akin to the silence that follows a long storm, that damp, clean silence that announces that the worst moment has passed and that whatever comes next, whatever it may be, will at least be different. They went out through the main door of the courthouse into an October afternoon that smelled of wet earth. The sky over Monterrey was that silvery gray that mountain skies have before rain, with the Sierra Madre peeking out in the distance as a permanent reminder that there are things that do not move, that do not change, that remain there no matter what humans do with their marriages and their signed papers and their broken hearts. Valentina breathed the cold air. She closed her eyes for an instant. Somewhere in that city, in a private clinic that smelled of white flowers and expensive silence, an 81-year-old man looked out the window of his room. A man who hadn't spoken to his daughter in 8 years. A man whose name, if spoken aloud in any business hall in Monterey, would make people stand up without even knowing exactly why. A man who that very morning had asked his personal assistant to find the address of Valentina Vega, his daughter. The only person in the world to whom he still owed something. Valentina didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover it, the hidden truth. There are secrets kept out of pride, others kept out of love, and some, the most dangerous, the heaviest, the ones that hurt the most when they finally come to light, are kept for both reasons at the same time, intertwined, like roots underground, impossible to separate without destroying everything else. Valentina Vega's secret was of that third type. No one in Rodrigo Montiel's life, not his mother, Doña Eugenia, who had treated Valentina with a cold courtesy afforded to a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit in the living room, nor his brother Fernando, who looked at her with that mixture of contempt and desire that certain men have, who never learn to respect what they cannot have, nor his bridge partners, nor his club friends, nor his wine-colored tie matrimonial lawyer. No one knew who the woman Rodrigo had married one May afternoon 8 years ago truly was. No one knew that Valentina didn't have the surname Vega because she was the daughter of any family. She had it because she was the daughter of Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros. Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros, the man who had built the Vega Group from scratch, a conglomerate of 43 companies distributed across the steel manufacturing, national logistics, solar energy, and industrial real estate sectors, which together had an estimated net worth, kept discreetly because Don Aurelio was one of those who preferred his figures not to circulate too much, of something close to $4 billion. $4 billion. The kind of number that doesn't easily enter the mind and that, when it does, completely reorganizes how one looks at the people around them. Don Aurelio Vega had been born in Linares, Nuevo Leon, the son of a truck mechanic and a primary school teacher. At 16, he had begun selling second-hand spare parts in the municipal market. At 23, he had his first dealership. At 31, his first manufacturing plant. The rest was the story that business books told with that reverential fascination the world bestows upon men who accumulate enormous fortunes from nothing, as if nothingness were a virtue, and not simply the starting point of many stories that end in very different ways. What the business books didn't tell was what had happened between Don Aurelio and his only daughter. Valentina was 25 years old when she met Rodrigo Montiel at a gala dinner at the Camino Real Hotel. She was there representing her father at a Chamber of Commerce event that Don Aurelio couldn't attend due to a business trip to Tokyo. Rodrigo was there because Rodrigo was always in all the right places at all the right times. It was one of his most cultivated talents. He saw her enter, followed her with his eyes throughout the dinner. At the end of the night, he asked for her number. What Rodrigo didn't know, and Valentina neither told him that night nor the following ones, nor during the 6 months of courtship that ensued, was that the elegant woman in the navy blue dress, who had given him her number on a white linen napkin, was the direct heir to one of the largest fortunes in the northeast of the country. Why didn't she say so? It was a question Valentina had asked herself many times over the years, especially in the darker moments of her marriage, when she wondered what would have changed and what would have remained the same had Rodrigo known the full truth from the beginning. The honest answer was complicated. Partly, it had been caution. Valentina had grown up watching how her father's surname acted as a magnet, attracting the wrong kind of attention. Men who wanted to be close to her, not for who she was, but for what she represented. Women who cultivated her friendship as if it were a strategic investment. She had learned to move with discretion, to use her mother's surname when she found herself in contexts where she didn't want to be recognized, to carefully measure to whom she revealed the full dimension of her story. But there was another reason, one that was harder for her to admit even to herself by the time she met Rodrigo. Valentina had been estranged from her father for almost 2 years. The rupture had been brutal in the quiet and definitive way things break between very proud people, without shouting, without scandal, without visible tears. Valentina was 22 when she told Don Aurelio she wanted to study textile design instead of business administration. Don Aurelio was 74, had a company to build, and a vision for the future that didn't include his only daughter going to Barcelona to learn to make fabrics. Do you study what I say, or figure out how to support yourself? Don Aurelio had said, his voice sounding like concrete. Then I'll support myself, Valentina had replied. And she left. She didn't go to Barcelona. She ended up staying in Monterey. She found work as an assistant at an interior design firm. She paid for a small apartment in the Colonia Obispo and lived for 3 years on an economic independence that was tight and complicated, and which, in retrospect, were perhaps the 3 freest years of her life. When she met Rodrigo, she was in that period. She was a woman with her own money, not much, but hers. Her own apartment, her own name, detached from the weight of her father's surname. She was Valentina Vega, a junior designer at a medium-sized company, and she liked that. She liked being that. Rodrigo courted her with an intensity that then seemed romantic to her, and which years later she would learn to recognize as the result of a very precise calculation. He showered her with attention, with dinners, with short trips to Mexico City and San Miguel de Allende, with the warm and addictive sensation of being seen, of mattering, of being the center of attention for an attractive and successful man who seemed genuinely fascinated by her. 6 months later, he proposed marriage on the terrace of a restaurant overlooking the mountains. Valentina said yes. That was when she had to speak to her father. The conversation was short and painful. Don Aurelio did not approve of Rodrigo, not because he knew anything specific against him, but because Don Aurelio did not approve of anything he hadn't decided himself first. He considered that his daughter was marrying too quickly to a man she barely knew, and that she was making such a major decision based on emotion rather than reason. If you marry that man, don't count on me, Don Aurelio had said. I haven't counted on you for 3 years, Papa, Valentina had replied. It changes nothing. She made the mistake of believing him. The wedding was intimate. On Rodrigo's side, 200 guests. On Valentina's side, 4 friends and a distant aunt. Her father's absence at the church was the first real crack. Although at that moment, Valentina refused to call it that. She told herself she was free, that she had chosen, that the consequences of one's own choices are born with dignity. The first 2 years of the marriage were, if not exactly happy, then functional. Rodrigo was attentive when it suited him, generous in his visible gestures, skilled at creating the illusion of a solid marriage in front of others. What Valentina gradually discovered, first with confusion, then with clarity, and finally with a resignation that shames her to recall, was that for Rodrigo, she was fundamentally an accessory, a beautiful, well-educated woman with no visible family drama, because he knew nothing of her father, who perfectly fulfilled the role of decorative wife that the implicit manual of the Montiel family demanded. He never hit her. He didn't cheat on her in a provable way, but he chipped away at her with small comments, with strategic silences, with the way he spoke of her opinions in front of others, with the way he made decisions that affected her without consulting her, and then looked at her as if consultation was a formality he had forgotten to mention he wasn't going to perform. 8 years is a long time for an intelligent person not to see what is in front of them. But Valentina saw it. She saw it layer by layer, with that slow, terrible slowness with which certain truths reveal themselves when one has invested too much in not wanting to see them. And when she finally saw it completely, when she understood that the marriage had no possibility of repair, that it wasn't a communication problem, but about who Rodrigo was at his core, and who she had been to choose him, she went to find Licenciada Fuentes. What she never did during all that time was call her father. Pride is a strange animal. It can keep you standing when everything else fails, but it can also keep you isolated when what you need is the exact opposite of being alone. Valentina had built her life on the premise that she didn't need Don Aurelio, that she was perfectly capable of solving her own problems, that the price she had paid for her independence, the distance from her father, the 8 years of silence, were worth what they had bought her. And perhaps they were worth it. Perhaps they still were. But as Valentina left family court number 4 and breathed the October air on the sidewalk of San Pedro Garza Garcia, her phone vibrated in her purse. It was an unknown number. A number from Monterrey, but one she didn't have saved. She let it vibrate. It vibrated again and again. Licenciada Fuentes looked at her from the side with a silent question in her eyes. Valentina took out her phone, looked at the screen. The number kept insisting with that quiet persistence that important things have. They don't rush, but they don't stop either. She answered. Hello, she said. On the other end, there was a 2-second silence, and then a voice Valentina hadn't heard in 8 years, but which she recognized the exact instant it entered her ear, as certain things the body holds are recognized, even if the mind decides to forget them. The smell of childhood, the taste of something you ate as a child, the voice of the first man who made you feel that the world was a place worth living in, her father's voice. Valentina, said Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros, and in that single word, her name. Pronounced with that voice of concrete and mountain, she remembered. There was something that hadn't been there 8 years ago. Fragility, a small but real fissure, like a crack in a seemingly solid wall. Valentina stopped on the sidewalk. The cold October wind moved a lock of hair over her cheek. Papa, she replied, and her own voice sounded strange, as if it had been stored in some internal drawer, and she had only just now remembered how to use it. I need to see you, Don Aurelio said. Today, if you can, it's important. Valentina looked at the gray sky over the mountains. She thought about the apartment in Cumbres she would have to return to that night. She thought about the 8 years. She thought about Rodrigo telling her that without his surname, she was nobody in that city. Where are you? She asked. And Don Aurelio gave her an address that wasn't his home nor his office. It was a private clinic in the municipality of San Pedro, a clinic with a discreet name and no large sign on the facade. The kind that exists precisely so that wealthy people can be sick without anyone knowing. Valentina understood the moment her father gave her that address that something had changed, that the call wasn't a Sunday reconciliation, it wasn't the prelude to a sermon, nor a negotiation disguised as affection. It was something different, something more urgent. She called a taxi and asked Licenciada Fuentes to excuse her. She got into the car as it drove south along Paseo de los Leones. Valentina looked out the window at the October trees with their leaves beginning to change color and felt somewhere, between her chest and stomach, that particular kind of vertigo one feels when realizing that life, without asking permission, has just taken a turn. The taxi took 17 minutes. She counted every one. The return of the father. The Santa Lucia clinic had no illuminated sign. It had no receptionist in a flashy uniform or televisions in the waiting room. It had instead white flowers in every corridor. Gardenias. Always gardenias. Because someone who knew wealthy patients knew that gardenias smell of calm, not of hospitals. And a discretion so perfectly calibrated that one could pass the gray granite facade 100 times without suspecting what was inside. Valentina entered and gave her father's name at reception. The woman behind the counter, young, serene, with the trained smile of someone who knows that the greatest service she can provide is not to ask questions. She typed something into her computer. She nodded and called a nurse who appeared in exactly 30 seconds and led Valentina down a light gray carpeted hallway to the south wing of the second floor. The nurse stopped in front of the door to room 214. He knocked twice softly with his knuckles. Wait, said the voice from inside, and Valentina pushed the door open. Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros was sitting in the armchair by the window, not in the bed. That detail was the first thing Valentina noticed, and it was also, without her being able to explain exactly why, what most relieved her. A man sitting in an armchair is still a man who has control over where he places his body. A man in bed is something else. He was 81 years old, and wore it with the severe dignity of men who have worked too hard to learn to age gracefully, but who have accumulated enough character for old age not to diminish them. He was tall, although now his height was more noticeable in the way he sat than in actual centimeters. He had completely white hair, cut very short, and large, gnarled hands that rested on the arms of the armchair with a stillness that was difficult for him to maintain. That was noticeable. He wore dress pants and a button-down shirt without a tie, as if he had refused to wear a hospital gown on principle. The eyes were the same. That was the second thing Valentina noticed. The eyes of Don Aurelio Vega, dark, direct, with that habit of looking that men who have spent decades evaluating situations and people in fractions of a second have, were exactly as she remembered them. Time had modified many things in that man, but it had not touched his eyes. They looked at each other. 8 years of silence occupy a physical space in a room. Valentina felt it as something tangible, almost like pressure in her chest as she crossed the threshold and closed the door behind her. Sit down, said Don Aurelio. It wasn't a request, nor was it exactly an order. It was the way that man had always spoken, from the center of the conviction that things should be done in a certain way, and that he had the responsibility to indicate which way. Valentina settled into the chair opposite him, placed her purse on her lap, and waited. Don Aurelio studied her for a long moment. His gaze swept over her face, a look she remembered from childhood, the way her father used to watch her before making any important decision, as if measuring something that couldn't be measured with instruments. You've lost weight? He finally said. I was married for 8 years, Valentina replied. That'll do it. Something shifted in Don Aurelio's expression. It wasn't a smile, but something more complex. Perhaps the acknowledgement of a well-aimed blow, or the dawning of something he was finding difficult to articulate. How did it end today? He asked. I signed. Did he leave you anything? An apartment and a 3-year pension. Don Aurelio frowned with an intensity Valentina recognized perfectly. It was the expression he wore when he heard something he considered unacceptable, but for some reason didn't quite understand yet. And the lawyers told you that was fair? They told me I could fight for more. I chose not to. Why? Valentina looked him directly in the eye. 8 years ago, she would have looked away. Not anymore. Because she didn't want anything that came from him. Not a cent, not a piece of furniture, not a square inch of land, nothing. She wanted to walk away clean. Don Aurelio nodded slowly, a gesture that didn't necessarily signify agreement, but rather understanding. He looked toward the window. Outside, the clinic's garden had rows of orange trees and a wrought iron bench that no one ever used. I should have called you sooner, he said, his gaze still fixed on the garden. Yes, Valentina replied. You should have. I was stubborn. Arrogant too. That as well. Don Aurelio turned his head and looked at her again. And now, there was something different in his eyes. Something Valentina took a second to identify because she hadn't seen it in him since she was a child. Real vulnerability. Not a performance, not a strategy, not a calculated concession. Authentic vulnerability, the kind that surfaces when something internal, an illness, a loss, the accumulated weight of years, strips away the armor built to avoid needing anyone. I have pancreatic cancer, Don Aurelio said. Stage 3. They diagnosed me 4 months ago. The silence that followed was different from the previous one, heavier, with a different texture. Valentina said nothing for a moment. She processed the words with that part of her mind that receives grave news before the emotions arrive, a border region, where everything is still information, not yet feeling. What did the doctor say? She finally asked, her voice serene. That with treatment, I have between 1 and 3 years? That without it, less. Are you in treatment? I started 3 weeks ago. He paused. I don't like it, but I don't like the alternative either. Despite everything, despite the 8 years, The harsh words of their last conversation, all they had denied each other for so long, Valentina felt something in her chest she couldn't precisely name at that moment. It wasn't exactly pain. It was closer to a sudden understanding that the time you think you have is always less than you calculate, and that unfinished business doesn't disappear while you wait for the right moment to settle it. Why are you calling me now? She asked. Why today? Don Aurelio interlaced his fingers on his lap. It was a gesture Valentina remembered from her childhood when she saw him preparing to say something difficult. Because I found out about the divorce 3 weeks ago, he said. I have people who keep me informed. It wasn't espionage. It was concern. He paused. And because when I learned today was the signing day, I couldn't keep waiting for my pride to subside enough to call you. Valentina studied him, searching his aged face for anything that might tell her if what she was hearing was real, or just another maneuver from a man who had built his fortune by being the most skilled negotiator in every room he'd ever entered. She found no maneuver. Instead, she found something she recognized, something she had seen in the mirror many times over the past few years. The specific exhaustion of someone who has carried a posture for too long, one they can no longer sustain. What do you want, Papa? She asked. The word Papa came out with less difficulty than enter. She expected. Don Aurelio looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice like concrete now with crack down the center. I want to know my daughter, the one you really are, not the one I had in my head when I was too proud to ask. The garden outside remained the same. The rows of orange trees, the unused iron bench, the gray sky over the mountains. Valentina looked at it all, then back at her father. That's going to take time, she said. I know. A pause. That's why I called today, not tomorrow. Valentina thought of Rodrigo telling her she was nobody without his last name. She thought of 8 years of silence. She thought of 3 years of a functional marriage that had devolved into 5 years of slow, systematic erosion. She thought of the signing that morning, the black pen on paper, the way she had walked out of the courthouse without looking back. And she thought of something her mother, who had died when Valentina was 17 from a silent heart attack one January morning, had once told her, in one of those moments of clarity mothers have, when speaking to daughters who don't yet understand what they need to hear. Life doesn't ask if you're ready, Mija, it just moves on. You decide whether to run after it or wait for it sitting down. All right, Valentina said finally. Don Aurelio nodded. Just once. But in that nod was something that hadn't been between them for 8 years. They talked for 2 hours. It was a strange, fragmented conversation, punctuated by the silences that fall between people who know each other too well and yet almost not at all. Don Aurelio asked about her work. Valentina had returned to interior design as a freelancer in the last 2 years of the marriage, when Rodrigo could no longer take that away from her. He also asked about her friends. He didn't ask about Rodrigo beyond what they had already said. What he knew was enough. Valentina, in turn, asked about the doctors, the treatment, how he was feeling physically. Don Aurelio answered with the brevity of a man unaccustomed to speaking of his body, as if it were something that could betray him. It was toward the end of the visit, as Valentina was gathering her purse and the afternoon outside had deepened to that profound blue characteristic of October skies in Monterey before night fully falls, that Don Aurelio said something that didn't seem calculated, but which, in retrospect, would change everything. Valentina, he said, his voice now possessing that crack. That man knows who you are. She stopped. She turned. Rodrigo? Yes? No? He never knew? A pause. I never told him. Don Aurelio looked at her for a moment, and in his dark eyes, something passed that Valentina couldn't quite interpret at that instant. A kind of light that wasn't exactly satisfaction, but wasn't neutral either. Good, Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros said. Just that. Good. A small word spoken by a large man in an armchair by a window with orange trees outside. A word that sounded more like a decision than a comment. Valentina looked at him for another second, intrigued by something she couldn't yet name. Then, she said goodbye, stepped into the pale gray, carpeted corridor, descended the stairs, and emerged into the October night that smelled of wet earth and something that was beginning. She didn't know it yet, but Don Aurelio Vega was already thinking. The Empire awakens. There is a way of seeing the world that is developed only by certain men who have built great things from the ground up. A way of looking at any situation, any problem, any person, any conflict, not as what it is on the surface, but as what it can become if the right pieces are moved in the right order. Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros had developed this way of seeing the world at 23, when he had to choose between paying the rent for his first shop or paying his 2 first employees, and he understood that no problem has only one solution, if one has the patience to find the angle from which the problem becomes something else. The night after Valentina left the clinic, Don Aurelio didn't sleep. It wasn't the illness. The pain was manageable that night. The medication did its job with an efficiency he appreciated without undue gratitude, for his mind was ignited in that specific way it became when he was calculating something. It was a sensation he recognized as an old, familiar tool, that state of total attention in which the rest of the world becomes background noise, and only the problem, the variables, the possibilities exist. The problem was Rodrigo Montiel, not in the sentimental sense of the term. Don Aurelio had the emotional capacity of a man of his generation and origin, which meant emotions existed, but they operated on a separate register from decisions. The problem was Rodrigo Montiel in the practical, structural sense of the term, a man who had harmed his daughter for 8 years, who had let her leave the marriage with the bare minimum, who had told her, Don Aurelio had learned from the same person who kept him informed of Valentina's movements, that without his last name, she was nobody. That was unacceptable. Not because Don Aurelio was a particularly sentimental man, but because he was a man who understood the value of things, and his daughter was worth infinitely more than Rodrigo Montiel had decided she was. And because there was something in that phrase, without my last name, you are nobody, that irritated him with a precision that went beyond paternal indignation. It irritated him because it was precisely the kind of statement made by a man who has never had to build anything, who inherited his position, and confuses that inheritance with merit, who measures others by the same flawed yardstick by which he measures himself. Don Aurelio had known hundreds of men like Rodrigo Montiel. He had seen them up close in boardrooms, at business dinners, in the halls of industry chambers, where the sons of the rich gathered to talk about their achievements, as if those achievements were their own, and not the direct result of being born in the right place. They were men who confused inherited money with intelligence, family name with vision, comfort with strength. They were, in the language Don Aurelio used internally to categorize people, men of cardboard, impressive from the front, with nothing solid behind. He got up from the armchair at 2 a.m. The night nurse heard him move and peeked her head in. He dismissed her with a gesture and walked to the small desk he had requested be placed in his room on his first day of hospitalization, because Don Aurelio Vega, without a desk, was like a bird without a branch. Technically possible, but visibly uncomfortable. He opened his laptop and began to review what he already knew about Montiel Industries. It wasn't new information. His analysis team, a discrete department within the Vega Group dedicated to monitoring the business environment of the northeast of the country, had been producing reports on the region's major companies for years. Montiel Industries was on that list, not for any special reason, but because it was a relevant medium-sized company in the metal component manufacturing sector, with important contracts with various companies in Nuevo Leon's industrial supply chain. But now Don Aurelio read it with different eyes, and what he found was both exactly what he expected and more than he had calculated. Montiel Industries operated with a supplier structure that, at its most fundamental level, relied on 3 major supply chains: high-strength steel for its manufacturing lines, logistics services for national product distribution, and energy for its industrial plants in the Monterey-Saltillo corridor. Don Aurelio reviewed the numbers twice. Then he called his personal assistant, Marco Villanueva, 38 years old, the most discreet and competent man who had worked for him in the last 15 years, on the phone. Regardless of the time being 2:15 a.m., Marco answered on the second ring. He never complained about the hours. It was one of the things Don Aurelio appreciated most about him. I need you to confirm something for me, Don Aurelio said, without preamble. Do the group subsidiaries that handle steel distribution for the industrial corridor of Nuevo León, Aceros del Norte, have a current contract with Montiel Industries? It took Marco exactly 40 seconds to consult the systems. Yes, a 2-year supply contract, renewable, expires next March. The contract represents approximately 34% of the steel Montiel uses in its Santa Catarina plant. Don Aurelio nodded to himself in the darkness of his room. And Transportes Vega del Norte? Do they have any relationship with them? Another 30 seconds. Yes, they are the third-party logistics provider. It's not the largest contract, but they move Montiel's finished product to their distributors in El Bajío. They represent about 22% of your national logistics. And for energy? A longer pause, this time not directly, but the Santa Catarina plant buys energy through a consortium that includes Energía Solar del Noreste, which, as you know, is 41% owned by Grupo Vega since the last investment round. Don Aurelio closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his expression was the same as always, calm, focused, with no outward signs of what he was processing, but something in the stillness of his hands on the desk said he had made a decision. Good, he said. Tomorrow, I want a meeting with the contracts team at 9 a.m. here at the clinic. Have them bring the complete files for all 3 commercial relationships. May I ask the reason? Marco said. He was the only person who dared to ask that question. We're going to do a portfolio review, Don Aurelio replied. Routine. We're evaluating which contracts we want to renew and which ones are not strategically beneficial for us. Marco fell silent for a second. He knew the man too well to believe anything was routine when a meeting was called at 2 a.m. They'll be here at 9, he said simply. Don Aurelio hung up, leaned back again in the armchair by the window. The garden outside was dark and still, only the orange trees visible as pale shadows under the garden light. He thought of Valentina leaving the courthouse that morning. He thought of the 8 years of silence between them. He thought of what that time had wasted, of what he hadn't been present to see, of the things his daughter had had to face alone, because they had both been too alike, too proud, too sure of being right, to yield first. And he thought of Rodrigo Montiel in his perfectly tailored black suit, telling Valentina that without his surname she was no one. There was an irony in all of it that Don Aurelio found in the darkness of 2 a.m., almost geometrically perfect. The man who had humiliated his daughter, believing she was no one, had no idea that for 8 years he had been supported in part by the money of that woman's father, that the steel he used to manufacture his components came from a company owned by Don Aurelio, that the trucks that moved his products across the country were, to a significant fraction, Vega Group trucks, that the energy that powered his plants ran partly through a network where Don Aurelio's money held 41%. He hadn't planned it that way. It was simple market geometry. When one has companies in so many sectors of the regional economy, points of contact with other companies are inevitable, invisible, constant. But now that he saw them, he couldn't help but appreciate the elegance of the matter. The 9 a.m. meeting was precise and efficient. Marco arrived with 2 directors and the complete files. Don Aurelio listened to them, asked precise questions, reviewed the contract clauses, with that attention to detail he had not lost with the years or with illness. At the end of the meeting, he gave instructions. None of them sounded in the cold, technical language of business as revenge. He instructed Marco to initiate a strategic review process of all supply contracts that Grupo Vega had with companies in the manufacturing sector in the Nuevo León corridor. It was a perfectly reasonable measure of the type that any large conglomerate periodically undertakes to optimize its portfolio. He asked the director of Aceros del Norte to evaluate the advisability of renewing the contract with Montiel Industries upon its expiration in March, considering that they had identified other potential clients with greater volume and better margins. He asked the director of Transportes to review the efficiency of the Bajío routes and consider reallocating capacity towards more profitable contracts. All perfectly reasonable, all perfectly documented, all perfectly invisible for what it truly was. Only Marco, who had known him for 15 years, noticed something as he left the meeting. That his boss, who normally ended meetings with the same neutral expression with which he began them, I left this one with something different in his eyes. It wasn't exactly satisfaction. It was something more akin to what a chess player has when they see clearly 3 moves ahead. How will the game end? Marco didn't ask. He never asked when the boss had that expression. Meanwhile, in the offices of Montiel Industries, in the Gomez Tower in downtown San Pedro Garza Garcia, Rodrigo Montiel was spending his first day as a divorced man with the quiet comfort of someone who feels they have shed a burden. He had lunch with his brother Fernando at the Hotel Presidente restaurant. He reviewed the quarter's numbers with his CFO. Good numbers, as always. The company was doing well. He answered messages, signed documents. He didn't think of Valentina more than twice. The first time, to recall with satisfaction the expression on her face as she signed. The second, to note with slight irritation that her signature on the divorce papers was still Valentina Vega and not Valentina Montiel, as if the surname had never been entirely hers. He didn't know that 180 meters from his office, in a gray quarry clinic with orange trees in the garden, an 81-year-old man with pancreatic cancer and $4 billion had just begun to move pieces. He didn't yet know that the surname he had scorned was precisely the surname that would destroy him, public humiliation. 3 weeks after the divorce, Monterey had that dry, luminous November temperature that makes everything seem sharper than it is. The hills closer, the colors more vivid, the light more honest. It was the kind of afternoon when the city looks beautiful from the outside and complicated from the inside, which is more or less how it had always been. The event was the annual gala of the Northeast Business Foundation, held in the grand ballroom of the Quinta Real Hotel in San Pedro. It was one of those events that in Monterey function as a social thermometer. If you're invited, you matter. If you're at the front table, you matter a lot. If you're not, people notice and comment with that sharp discretion that the Monterey high society has for registering significant absences. Valentina was there because Sofia Garmendia, her 20-year friend, an artist and jewelry designer with her own studio in the Armenia neighborhood and the only person from her social circle Valentina had kept without filters or negotiations during the marriage, had invited her. Sofia had insisted with a mix of affection and pragmatism that Valentina recognized as one of her most valuable attributes. You can't stay in your apartment in Las Cumbres reading and taking the rest of your life. Go out, show yourself, let them see you're doing well. I don't need them to see me, perhaps not, but you need to remember that you exist beyond that marriage. Valentina had conceded, because deep down, she knew Sofia was right, and because there was something in the idea of appearing in public, well-dressed, serene, under her own name, that seemed not exactly necessary, but in a way a form of affirmation. She arrived with Sofia at 8:15 p.m. She wore a simple and elegant wine-colored silk dress, her hair down, gold earrings that had been hers since before the marriage. Nothing borrowed, nothing from the Montiels. Sofia wore a perfectly fitting emerald green pantsuit and the expression of someone ready to enjoy the night no matter what happened. The ballroom was full, round tables with white linen tablecloths, tropical flower centerpieces, warm light coming from crystal chandeliers on the artisanal ceiling. 200 people from the business and social world of Nuevo Leon, all in their best versions, the most expensive suits, the most discreetly spectacular jewelry, the most calibrated conversations. Valentina knew many people in that room. She had spent 8 years attending exactly these kinds of events as Rodrigo Montiel's wife, smiling in the right places, saying the right things, being the version of herself that role demanded. Now she was simply Valentina Vega. No one had seen her like this in a long time. The first glances were of surprise, then evaluation, then in most cases, genuine cordiality or cordiality sufficiently well simulated to make it irrelevant. They greeted some people. They found their table near the center. A good location. Sophia had chosen well. They ordered wine. Everything was going with a normality that Valentina was beginning to appreciate. It was 40 minutes later when Rodrigo entered. He didn't enter alone. He entered with Isabella Fuentes Cardenas, 31 years old. Daughter of an industrialist family from Guadalajara, known in Monterrey circles for her participation in several boards of directors, and for a spectacular beauty she used with the awareness of someone who perfectly understands it's an asset. She wore a red dress with a plunging neckline and bare shoulders, long straight black hair, and the expression of someone arriving at a place knowing exactly the effect they are going to have. Rodrigo wore the same black suit as always, the same watch, the same posture of a man who owns the space he moves in. He entered greeting, shaking hands with that social ease that had been, in the early days, one of the things Valentina had found attractive about him. Isabella walked beside him with the precision of someone who has studied how to move in that type of setting. Sophia saw him first. She put her hand on Valentina's arm. Are you okay? Perfectly? Valentina said without looking where Sophia was looking. Then, because it was inevitable, she looked, she saw them, she processed the image with that part of her mind that registers without dramatizing. She felt something, not exactly pain, not exactly nothing either, that settled somewhere between her ribs, and she let it be. Fine, Valentina said, in a very low voice, and took her wine glass. For the next hour, their paths in the ballroom did not cross. Valentina spoke with Sophia, with the director of an architecture firm she knew from work, with the wife of a textile entrepreneur who turned out to be interesting and fun. She ate. She drank moderately. She found herself present for the conversations, lending them the full, unwavering attention that had always eluded her when her interest wasn't genuine. It was during the official toast, as the foundation's president took the podium, that the room's hum of chatter subsided and heads turned vaguely toward the front. That was when Rodrigo crossed the space towards the sidebar and saw her. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Rodrigo murmured something to Isabella, who nodded with a smile and remained where she was. Rodrigo then walked towards Valentina, exuding that self-assured male composure that suggests the space inherently belongs to him. Valentina, he said as he approached, not loudly, but not softly either, that calculated middle ground, pitched just right to be heard by the closest few in a half-full room. Sophia, standing beside Valentina, held her breath. I'm doing very well, thank you, Valentina replied, her tone equally neutral. I didn't expect to see you here. A beat of silence, punctuated by a half smile. How's the Department of Summits going? Have you found its charm yet? I'm very well, thank you, Valentina said. I'm glad. Rodrigo glanced at his drink, then back at her, his expression almost kind, if you didn't know what lay beneath. Listen, I'm happy you're out. It would be a shame if you stayed locked away. A woman like you needs to be seen, needs company, a calculated break, or whatever you can manage under the circumstances. It was a phrase meticulously crafted, like a watchmaker's finest work. On the surface, it sounded like concern. But heard in full, with the inflection, the pause, the look that accompanied it, it was precisely what it was. A public reminder that he had swiftly and elegantly rebuilt his life, while she, by contrast, was in a situation he deemed precarious. The three people nearest them heard it all. Valentina saw it in their faces, that peculiar discomfort of witnessing something unpleasant at an event where civility was expected. Valentina looked at Rodrigo for a moment, then smiled. Not a smile of discomfort, not a conciliatory smile, but a genuine, calm smile, the kind people wear when they are at peace with their own self-knowledge. Rodrigo said, You've been in this room for 20 minutes, and you already have the look of someone who needs to be seen being happy. I hope it works. He turned, picked up his glass, and rejoined the conversation he had interrupted, as if their exchange had been a mere footnote, too insignificant to alter the course of the evening. Rodrigo remained still for a second, then walked back towards Isabella. Sophia exhaled slowly beside Valentina. My God, she murmured. What? Valentina asked. You're extraordinary. Valentina took a sip of wine. Inside, in that space between her ribs where something had settled an hour earlier, the sensation was complex. It wasn't triumph, not exactly relief. It was something closer to confirmation of what she already knew, that she could be in the same room as that man and remain whole, that the damage he had tried to inflict for 8 years hadn't stripped her of this. Valentina didn't see him, because she was facing away from the side entrance to the room, and because no one at that moment was paying attention to the discreet figure who had entered 10 minutes earlier and taken a table at the back, at a special request. Without identifying himself to the staff beyond a name none of those present recognized. It was the 81-year-old man, impeccably dressed in a dark, understated suit, who observed the entire exchange from a side table with serene, total attention. Don Aurelio Vega had been released from the clinic that afternoon, with medical permission. No more than 4 hours, he had negotiated with his doctor with the same unyielding firmness with which he negotiated everything. Marco had informed him that Valentina would be at the event, and something in him needed to see for himself what his assistant had described in words. He saw it all. He saw Rodrigo enter with Isabella. He saw the calculated trajectory towards Valentina. He heard not the exact words, but the tone, the posture, the gesture enough to understand what was happening, and he saw his daughter respond with a calm he recognized as his own, the same calm he had employed in 100 difficult negotiations throughout his life, the calm of someone who knows they are right and has no need to prove it with noise. As Rodrigo moved away and Valentina resumed her conversation, Don Aurelio placed his coffee cup back on the table. He wiped his mouth with his napkin and stood up with the careful slowness his body now demanded. He then signaled Marco, who was waiting by the side door. He left the room unnoticed. In the car, on the way back to the clinic, with the lights of San Pedro gliding past the window, Don Aurelio made a single call to the director of Aceros del Norte. The contract review process with Montiel, he said, accelerate it. I want a resolution before the end of the month. We'll cancel the renewal. Evaluate all options. He hung up. He looked out the window at the dark hills on the horizon. He wanted a resolution before the month was out. And Don Aurelio Vega, when he wanted something to happen before the month was out, it always happened before the month was out. The first blow. The first indication arrived on a Tuesday morning, 18 days after the gala, in the form of an email bearing the letterhead of Aceros del Norte S.A. Rodrigo Montiel was in his 12th floor office at Torre Gomez, when his operations director, Licenciada Patricia Serna, knocked on his door in her characteristic manner. 2 precise taps, a brief pause, one more. He had learned to associate that knock with news requiring his attention. What's up? Rodrigo asked, without looking up from the report he was reviewing. Aceros del Norte has sent us a formal notification, Patricia Serna said, entering with a tablet in hand. They're informing us they won't renew the supply contract upon its March expiration. They cite a strategic reorientation of their client portfolio. Rodrigo looked up. What do you mean they're not renewing? That's what the notification says. Patricia handed him the tablet. They're not providing additional details beyond the standard non-renewal language. They are within the contractual notice periods, so technically, everything is in order. Rodrigo read the email twice. It was a perfectly neutral text, drafted with that corporate courtesy that says nothing and yet conveys exactly what it needs to. The business relationship is ending, and there's nothing to discuss. Call them, he said. I want to speak with the commercial director today. Patricia nodded and left. Rodrigo stared at the tablet screen for another moment, with that faint, indefinable sensation of hearing a strange noise in the night and not being sure whether to worry. Aceros del Norte was his primary supplier of high-strength steel, accounting for 34% of his total input for the Santa Catarina plant. It wasn't irreplaceable. Other suppliers existed in the market, but they were the most competitive in price and had the tightest delivery times for his production lines. Finding a substitute would take time, and in manufacturing, time always came at a cost. The call with the commercial director of Aceros del Norte took place that afternoon. It was brief and, ultimately, fruitless. The director was perfectly polite, perfectly vague, and perfectly firm that the decision was final and came from the highest levels of the company. There was no room for negotiation, no alternative offer that could sway their position. The strategic reorientation, he explained, was part of a portfolio review process affecting multiple clients and had no bearing on the quality of the business relationship with Montiel Industries. Rodrigo hung up with the unsettling feeling of someone who has been rejected without receiving a reason they can refute. Find alternatives, he told Patricia. Suppliers in Coahuila, in San Luis, whatever you can. I want options on my desk before Friday. 4 days later, as Patricia was still consolidating the analysis of alternative suppliers, the second blow arrived. This time, it was a call from Gerardo, the logistics director at Montiel Industries. A man who had been with the company for 11 years and had a habit of speaking 3 decibels lower when delivering bad news, as if the reduced volume could cushion the impact. Rodrigo, Gerardo said, his voice hushed, Transportes Vega del Norte has just informed us they won't be renewing the distribution contract for the Bajío region. They also mentioned strategic reorientation. Rodrigo fell silent for 3 seconds. Transportes Vega? Yes. When does their contract expire? In 6 weeks. Rodrigo placed the phone on his desk and stared at the ceiling of his office for a moment. The ceiling was polished concrete with exposed steel beams, a design choice he had made when he remodeled the space 4 years prior, and at this specific moment, it felt strangely oppressive. 2 suppliers, 2 non-renewal notices within 2 weeks, both citing the same strategic reorientation language. It was a statistically possible coincidence. In business, such confluences occurred. Contracts expired, companies reoriented their portfolios, markets adjusted, but something in Rodrigo Montiel, the instinct of a man who had spent his life in the business world and knew how to recognize patterns, even if he couldn't yet name them, began to trigger an alarm he couldn't quite interpret. He called his brother Fernando that same afternoon. Fernando Montiel was 3 years younger than Rodrigo, less disciplined, more expansive, possessing a real intelligence he had systematically squandered through a combination of overconfidence and a lack of effort. He was the director of new business development at Montiel Industries, a position that, in practice, meant attending high-level meetings and generating ideas that were sometimes brilliant and more often unfeasible. But he had something Rodrigo needed at that moment. Contacts in almost every business sector in Nuevo León, built over years of intense social presence. Fernando, I need you to get moving, Rodrigo said, when his brother arrived at his office that afternoon. I need to know if something strange is going on with Aceros del Norte and Transportes Vega del Norte. 2 non-renewals in 2 weeks. Same language. I want to understand if it's a market-wide systemic issue or if something specific is targeting us. Fernando listened with his characteristic expression of apparent nonchalance, which was actually disguised concentration. Do you have a hypothesis? He asked. No. A pause. Not yet. Fernando made calls that afternoon, and the next morning spoke with 3 contacts in the logistics sector, a couple of people from the steel industry, and someone who knew the organizational charts of several companies in Nuevo León's industrial corridor well. What he found wasn't concrete information, but something more diffuse, and therefore more unsettling. A pattern of silence. The people he spoke with knew something. That was perceptible, the way they cut off certain lines of conversation, the way their answers were a little too vague to be natural, but they wouldn't say it. There's something, Fernando told Rodrigo, when they met again the next day. I don't know what, but there's something. The people I spoke with know more than they're letting on, and none of them have an obvious interest in withholding information about manufacturing suppliers, unless the topic comes from someone they don't want to cross. Someone you don't want trouble with, Rodrigo repeated. Someone big, Fernando said. Someone before whom most players in the regional market would prefer not to be on the wrong side. Rodrigo processed that in Nuevo León. The list of business players large enough to generate that kind of preemptive silence around them wasn't long. It was 5, maybe 6 names, families, and conglomerates with real weight, with history, with the kind of market presence that made people think twice before positioning themselves against them. Don Aurelio Vega's name wasn't on the list, Rodrigo reviewed mentally. Not because he wasn't big enough. At $4 billion, he was perfectly large. But because Don Aurelio Vega was in the Monterrey business world, a practically legendary figure for his discretion. He didn't appear at association meetings, didn't give interviews, didn't attend galas or chamber events. He was the kind of man whose fortune everyone knew and whose face almost no one could describe in detail, because he never showed up in the places where wealthy people normally wanted to appear. Rodrigo didn't connect him, he had no reason to. Valentino was named Vega, yes, but Vega was a perfectly common surname in the northeast of the country. There was no visible thread connecting his ex-wife to the most discreet man in Regiomontano business. No visible thread. Meanwhile, at the Great Quarry Clinic, Don Aurelio received Marco's report each night with the same serene attention with which he had received business reports for 60 years. He listened, asked a question or two, nodded. One night, toward the end of the second week of movements, Marco told him, market analyses indicate Montiel Industries will have real difficulty replacing both contracts before their respective expirations. Alternative suppliers have lead times of between 8 and 14 weeks, and their prices are between 18 and 25% above current contracts. That will significantly impact their margins in the first quarter of next year. And the stock? Asked Don Aurelio. Montiel Industries had been listed on the Mexican Stock Exchange for 4 years. It hasn't moved yet. The market doesn't have enough information to react. But if this combines with the energy situation, what about the energy situation? Marco consulted his tablet. The consortium in which we participate with 41% has just notified its industrial clients of a tariff review process. It's not a cancellation, it's a price adjustment, but the proposed adjustment for the medium manufacturing segment is between 22 and 28% upward. Don Aurelio was silent for a moment. Is this an adjustment that affects only Montiel, or all clients in the segment? All of them. It's systemic. No one can claim discriminatory treatment. Good, said Don Aurelio. It was the second time he had used that word in that context. Marco had learned that when his boss said good, in that specific tone, without inflection, almost like a sustained musical note, it meant the pieces were falling exactly where he had calculated. Don Aurelio looked out the window, the garden at night, the orange trees like still shadows, the starless sky over the mountains. He thought of his daughter in that salon in her wine-colored dress, responding to Rodrigo Montiel with a calm smile, while he tried to diminish her in front of 3 people who were listening. And he thought that the world is, deep down, a fairer place than it seems. It just requires patience and knowing exactly where the strings are before you start pulling them. He took his coffee, drank it slowly, and said nothing more. Revelation, truth has a peculiar way of arriving. It doesn't always arrive like lightning, as people imagine. Sometimes it arrives slowly in layers, like water that finds the cracks in a wall and widens them with patience until one day the wall simply gives way, not from a blow, but from the accumulated weight of everything that is filtered through. That's how the truth arrived for Rodrigo Montiel. First was the financial analyst. His name was Esteban, 27 years old, the youngest on his team and the most meticulous, who had spent 3 weeks tracing the corporate origins of Acero del Norte and Transports Vega del Norte with the quiet determination of someone who knows that numbers always tell a story if one has the patience to read them to the end. He arrived at Rodrigo's office on a Wednesday at 4 p.m. with a blue folder under his arm and an expression that Rodrigo learned to read the instant Esteban closed the door behind him, the expression of someone who found something they didn't expect and weren't entirely sure how to deliver it. What did you find? Rodrigo said. Esteban opened the folder, placed on the desk a corporate structure diagram he had drawn by hand, with rectangles and arrows and company names connected in a network that at first glance seemed complicated, and that once one found the central node turned out to be perfectly simple. Acero del Norte, Esteban said, pointing to one of the rectangles, is 92% owned by CEB, Metales Industriales del Noreste. Metales Industriales del Noreste is in turn a 100% subsidiary of Grupo Vega Holding, based in Monterrey. Rodrigo looked at the diagram, said nothing yet. Transportes Vega del Norte, Esteban continued, pointing to another rectangle. It is directly a subsidiary of Grupo Vega Logistica, which is the logistics and distribution division of Grupo Vega. He paused. And the energy situation? Rodrigo asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. The energy consortium, in which we participate as clients, Esteban said, has as its majority partner with 41% Energia Solar del Noreste S, A to CV, which is also a subsidiary of Grupo Vega. Rodrigo didn't move for several seconds. The diagram on the desk was perfectly clear. There was no way to read it differently. The three pressures that had hit Montiel Industries in recent weeks, steel, logistics, energy, all originated, to varying degrees, from the same source, the same name. Vega, Grupo Vega. Rodrigo got up from his chair, walked to the window. From the 12th floor of the Torre Gomez, Monterrey stretched out as far as the mountains allowed. A mosaic of buildings, highways, industrial zones, all under that clear, dry November light that makes distances deceiving. Who controls Grupo Vega? He asked without turning. Esteban took a second. Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros, founder and controlling shareholder at 87%, 81 years old. Originally from Linares, Nuevo León. Company founded 58 years ago from scratch. Total assets estimated at... I know who he is, Rodrigo interrupted. Everyone in the Monterrey business world knew who Don Aurelio Vega was. He was a name that existed in that particular space of business reality, where wealth is so vast and so solidly built that the person who possesses it becomes a kind of geography, something that simply exists, that everyone knows, that no one questions. What Rodrigo didn't know was why. Why had Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros, a man who had never had any direct relationship with Montiel Industries or any member of the Montiel family, suddenly decided to cancel 3 commercial contracts that directly affected his company? What had Rodrigo done to deserve the attention and apparent antipathy of one of the most powerful men in the northeast of the country? He searched his memory with an urgency that was beginning to resemble panic. Replayed meetings, conversations, possible offenses or conflicts of interest with Grupo Vega, or any of its subsidiaries. He found nothing. He hadn't crossed paths with Don Aurelio Vega in any context he could recall. None. And then, with that terrible slowness with which certain understandings arrive when one has been avoiding them, Rodrigo thought of the surname Vega. Valentina Vega. He stood completely still by the window. No, he thought at first. It's a common surname. It's a coincidence. But the coincidence was too perfect. The surname, the timing, 3 weeks after the divorce, the geography, the scale, everything fit with a precision that made the word coincidence sound ridiculous. He called Fernando that same afternoon. I need you to find out everything you can about Valentina's family, he said. Her parents, her origins, everything. Fernando looked at him for a second with something Rodrigo couldn't decipher. Why? Do it? Fernando took 4 hours. When he returned, he had that particular expression of someone who has just understood something that completely rearranges how they have been viewing a situation. Valentina Vega Cisneros, he said with deliberate emphasis on the maternal surname. Only daughter of Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros and Mrs. Lucia Cisneros de Vega. Deceased 14 years ago. A pause. Rodrigo. Her father is Don Aurelio Vega. The silence that followed in the 12th floor office lasted exactly 8 seconds. Rodrigo counted them without knowing he was counting them. 8 years of marriage, 8 years living with the daughter of the most discreet and powerful man in the northeast of the country, 8 years without knowing it, 8 years in which Valentina had kept that secret with a consistency that now, from this side, seemed almost incomprehensible. Why hadn't she said anything? Why had she lived 8 years as Rodrigo Montiel's wife, without revealing she was the heir to a fortune that made the Montiel fortune seem modest? The answer came with a quiet brutality, because Rodrigo had never treated her as someone worth revealing anything important to, because from the beginning he had diminished her, contained her, convinced her, or tried to convince her that her value depended on him, on his surname, on his network, on his money, and she had known all along. She had known and had chosen not to play that card until now, or rather her father had chosen to play it for her. Rodrigo left the Torre Gomez at 6 p.m., got into his car, and told the chauffeur to take him to Santa Lucia Clinic. He had no appointment, hadn't called. He did so because he was the kind of man who believed personal urgency was reason enough to show up anywhere unannounced. They let him in. Don Aurelio had given instructions that he be admitted if he arrived, which said everything that needed to be known about who had real control of that situation. Room 214 smelled of gardenias and freshly brewed coffee. Don Aurelio was in the armchair by the window as always. He wore a button-down shirt and dress pants, not a hospital gown. His dark eyes, direct, with no visible surprise. Rodrigo entered, stood before him. It was the first time he had seen him in person, and at that moment, it was a distinctly disorienting experience. He had imagined during the drive a frail, ill old man. Someone disease had stripped of his weight. What he found was a man who occupied the space of the room in a way that had little to do with age and everything to do with character. Sit down, Don Aurelio said. Rodrigo didn't sit. You are Valentina's father? He said. Yes, Don Aurelio said. Why are you doing this? Don Aurelio looked at him for a moment with that gaze that assessed situations and people in fractions of a second. Then he said in a voice of concrete that held no inflection of anger or satisfaction, simply of certainty. Because you told my daughter in a courtroom, in front of her lawyer and yours, that without your surname she was nobody in this city. Rodrigo opened his mouth, closed it, and because for 8 years you treated her as if her value depended on you. A pause. My daughter is worth more than all you have, all you've had, and all you will have. And it was time someone showed you that in a way you could understand. This is a threat, Rodrigo said, his voice attempting firmness, but edged with something too close to fear. No, Don Aurelio replied with absolute calm. A threat is when you announce what you are going to do. What I am doing has already happened. He looked at his coffee cup. You came to ask me why. I've already explained. There's nothing more to discuss. Rodrigo stared at him for a long moment. He searched that 81-year-old face for anything he could use, any crack, any point of negotiation, any angle from which the situation might be reversed. He found none. Valentina knows nothing of this, he finally said. It was a statement, not a question. He said it because he needed to say something, because leaving in silence would be admitting a defeat his pride hadn't yet finished processing. No, Don Aurelio confirmed. This is between you and me. And what do you want in return? Rodrigo asked. Do you want something back? Different divorce terms? Money? Don Aurelio looked at him with something that in another man might have been called pity, but in him was simply distance. I want nothing from you, he said. There is nothing you have that I need. A pause. I came into this world with empty hands and built everything that exists. You came with everything, and are about to lose it. That is the difference between us. Rodrigo Montiel left Santa Lucia Clinic 15 minutes after arriving. He got into the car in silence. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror and asked nothing. Outside, Monterrey remained the same. The hills on the horizon, the afternoon light, the traffic on Paseo de los Leones, everything was the same. Only something in Rodrigo Montiel's world had crossed an irreversible border. In room 214, Don Aurelio finished his coffee. He called Marco. She's come, he said. How was it? Marco asked. Don Aurelio looked out the window at the orange trees in the garden. As I expected, he said. Continue with the process. He hung up, closed his eyes, and breathed slowly, with that careful breathing that illness had taught him to value. Each breath was a small, concrete gift, with no guarantees. He thought of Valentina, of her wine-colored dress, of her calm smile facing Rodrigo in the Quinta Real ballroom, of the way she had responded without needing anyone to defend her. She didn't need it, she never had, but he had done it anyway, because it was the only thing he could still give her, that she couldn't give herself. The total collapse. There is a kind of silence that precedes great breakdowns. It is not the silence of rest, nor the silence of peace. It is the tense, still silence of things just before gravity does what it was always going to do. A reminder to all that stands that no height is permanent if the foundations are laid poorly. That silence lasted exactly 9 days in Rodrigo Montiel's world. On the 10th day, the market reacted. It was not a dramatic collapse. Markets rarely collapse suddenly when dealing with medium-sized companies with history and reasonable income diversification. It was more like an erosion, an 8% drop in one trading session, followed by a partial recovery the next day, followed by another 6% drop, followed by a nervous stabilization that analysts described in their reports with words like supply chain uncertainty and pressure on operating margins and recommended monitoring. The language of financial analysts has that peculiarity. It can say that something is falling apart using words that sound like simple caution. Rodrigo read those reports every morning with the expression of a man who knows exactly what they mean and yet cannot help but search them for a different, more optimistic reading that isn't there. The CFO of Montiel Industries, a man named Arturo, who had worked with the family for 16 years and possessed the common virtue of speaking the truth, however uncomfortable, requested an urgent meeting at the end of the second week. Rodrigo, Arturo said, sitting across from the 12th floor desk, his folders neatly arranged, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation several times before having it. I need you to understand the full dimension of what is happening. I understand it, Rodrigo said. I don't think you fully do. A pause. The non-renewal of the steel contract, combined with the energy rate adjustment and the logistics reassignment, will cost us approximately 19% of our gross margin in the first quarter of next year. In absolute terms, we're talking about an operational loss of between 42 and 58 million pesos that we hadn't budgeted for. Rodrigo said nothing. That's the direct impact, Arturo continued. The indirect impact is more complicated. 3 of our partners in the investment fund that capitalized us 2 years ago have clauses for position review if the stock falls more than 15% in a 30-day period. It's already fallen 14.3%. If it reaches 15%, when will it reach 15%? Rodrigo interrupted. Arturo looked at him for a second. If we do nothing? Between 7 and 12 days. Rodrigo stood up and walked to the window. The panorama of Monterrey from the 12th floor remained the same. The hills, the highways, the industrial corridor in the distance, but at that moment, all of it seemed more distant than before, as if the distance between him and the city had grown several centimeters without anyone having moved him from his spot. What options do we have? He said. Arturo opened his folder. 3. The first is emergency capitalization. To seek new investors who will come in at a discounted price before the situation deteriorates further. The problem is time and timing. No one enters at a preferential price into a company that is visibly declining without demanding very favorable conditions for themselves. The second is debt restructuring with the main banks, renegotiating terms and conditions to alleviate short-term cash flow pressure. The third is to sell non-strategic assets, the Saltillo plant, the Guadalajara warehouse, to generate immediate liquidity. Rodrigo listened to it all with a stillness that Arturo, who knew him well, correctly interpreted. It wasn't the stillness of someone processing options. It was the stillness of someone who already understood that none of the 3 options solved the root problem. Leave the analysis on my desk, Rodrigo said finally. I'll call you tomorrow. Arturo left. Rodrigo remained alone in the office and called Fernando. Fernando arrived 20 minutes later with his usual energetic demeanor of a man always in motion, but this time, as he entered and saw his brother's face, he visibly moderated himself. He sat down without saying anything and waited. We're going to lose the company, Rodrigo said. Fernando didn't respond immediately. It was one of his few consistent virtues. He didn't say unnecessary things when what the situation called for was listening. We won't lose it all at once, Rodrigo continued. It will be slower, more visible, a pause, more humiliating. Is there anything we can do? Rodrigo looked at his brother. In Fernando's face, there was something Rodrigo hadn't seen before with such clarity. Real concern. Not the superficial worry of someone afraid of losing comforts, but something deeper and more honest, the kind that appears when people face consequences they never calculated because they never thought they could arrive. There are things that can be done, Rodrigo said, but the root problem has no easy solution. The root problem is that Don Aurelio Vega has decided we are the target, and as long as that doesn't change, anything we do is patching a boat that already has water inside, and there's no way to talk to him, to reach an agreement. I went, Rodrigo said. He wants nothing from us, he said it plainly. A long pause. He's right, there's nothing we can offer him that's worth anything to him. The silence between the 2 brothers at that moment had a different texture than all the previous silences. It was the silence of a shared, uncomfortable, and definitive understanding that they had reached a point where their usual resources, money, connections, negotiation, the power of a name were insufficient, that they were facing something bigger than themselves, built with a solidity that left them without real leverage. What neither of them said aloud, though both thought it, was that there was one person whose mediation might perhaps change something. A person who had access to Don Aurelio in a way that no lawyer, no business intermediary, no call from any political contact could replicate. Valentina. The following week was the hardest in Montiel Industries' recent history. The stock crossed the 15% drop mark. 2 of the 3 fund partners activated their review clauses. The banks called urgent meetings. Alternative steel suppliers confirmed delivery times of at least 12 weeks. Rodrigo's corporate email filled with messages he kept postponing, because all his replies would require admitting something his character still resisted admitting. It was Doña Eugenia who called first. Doña Eugenia Montiel de Salcedo, 73 years old. The matriarch of the family, a woman of that generation who had learned that female power is exercised from the living room of the house, not from boardrooms, and that conviction had given her real influence over her family for decades, even if no document registered it. She called Rodrigo on Wednesday at 10 a.m., with that voice of a lady who never asks but states. Rodrigo, I need you to come for lunch today. It will be Fernando, you, and me. The lunch at Doña Eugenia's house in Colonia del Valle was one of those experiences that only exist in families, where hierarchies are ancient and silences are eloquent. They ate noodle soup and grilled meat in the mahogany dining room, with the special day china that Doña Eugenia also used on days of crisis, because she believed difficult moments deserved the same dignity as celebratory ones. When the maid cleared the plates and left them alone with the coffee, Doña Eugenia looked at her two sons with a gaze she had perfected over 73 years of life and said, "You need to talk to Valentina." Rodrigo placed his cup on its saucer. "Mom, don't interrupt me." A pause. "I know what happened. I know what you said to her in court." Another, longer pause. "And I know, because I'm not stupid, even if they sometimes treat me as if I were, that what is happening with the company has to do with her father." Fernando looked at the table. "She is the only person who can intervene," Doña Eugenia continued. "And she will, or she won't. But you won't know unless you go ask her." "Ask her?" Rodrigo said, his voice tinged with something that resembled indignation but was actually wounded pride. "We asked Valentina to convince her father to leave us alone." "You asked Valentina to speak with her father?" Doña Eugenia said with calm firmness. "What she decides to do with that conversation is her business." A pause. "And Rodrigo, when you go, ask for forgiveness. Not because it's convenient, but because you owe it." The silence that followed was the heaviest of the afternoon. 2 days later, Rodrigo and Fernando presented themselves at the Cumbres apartment where Valentina lived. It was a modern 10-story building in the northern part of Monterrey, perfectly respectable, well below the standard of living Valentina had enjoyed during her marriage. Rodrigo had been in that building once when the lawyers coordinated the handover of keys and had looked at it with his evaluating gaze that classified everything in terms of value and social standing. Valentina greeted them, opened the door, saw them both in the hallway, and remained silent for a second. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment was small and immaculately tidy. There were plants in the corners, books on wooden shelves she'd assembled herself, a work desk with sketches of interior design projects, an Italian coffee maker on the kitchen counter. It was a space that smelled of coffee and wood, and in its carefully cultivated simplicity, possessed a dignity Rodrigo felt but couldn't name. They sat in the small living room. Valentina went to the kitchen and returned with 3 cups of coffee, placing them on the low table without asking if they wanted any. Rodrigo spoke first, the words laborious, each one carrying the specific weight that words acquire when pride has occupied the rightful space for years. "Valentina," he said, "we've come to ask you to speak with your father." Valentina looked at him, then at Fernando, then back at him. "I know," she said. "You know, my father called me 3 days ago to tell me what he'd done. He didn't ask my permission. He didn't ask if I wanted him to do it. He called to tell me he'd done it because it was something he felt he had to do, and to ask my forgiveness if it caused me any problems." Rodrigo processed this for a moment. "And what did you tell him?" Valentina held her coffee cup in both hands. She gazed out the window, where Monterrey, seen from the 4th floor, appeared smaller and more human than from the 12th floor of the Torre Gomez. "I told him I hadn't asked him to do it," she replied, "and I wasn't going to ask him to undo it." The ensuing silence was definitive in the way certain silences are, because there was nothing left to add that could change what had just been said. Fernando looked at the table. Rodrigo looked at Valentina with an expression that was no longer that of the confident, condescending man from the courthouse, nor the irritated, calculating man from the gala, but something more naked and smaller than all of that. The expression of someone who has just understood, with a clarity too late to be useful, the true magnitude of what he had done. "Is there anything we can do?" Fernando asked, his voice lower than usual. Valentina looked at them both for a moment. "Talk to lawyers," she said finally. "Restructure the company, find new suppliers, build something that doesn't depend on someone else not wanting to destroy it." It was perfectly practical, perfectly honest advice, devoid of unnecessary cruelty. It was also a farewell. She stood up, went to the door, and opened it. The 2 men rose. Fernando exited first. Rodrigo paused on the threshold. He looked at her, and for the first time, in the 8 years they had known each other, through all the events, all the dinners, all the moments of a marriage that now seemed to belong to another version of himself, he didn't know what to say. "Valentina," he finally said. "Rodrigo," she responded, without anger or affection, just his name, a neutral acknowledgement of his existence. She closed the door, remaining alone in her small, tidy apartment, with her plants and her books, her design sketches, and her Italian coffee maker. She sat in the armchair, picked up her coffee cup, now cold, and outside, Monterrey remained unchanged. The hills, the light, the muffled roar of the city that doesn't stop for anyone's dramas. The inheritance arrived in December in Monterrey with that end-of-year light that carries a sense of involuntary reckoning, as if the quality of the light itself demanded a clearer perspective than they had possessed in the preceding months. Sharper, more honest, less willing to sustain illusions that the year had systematically dismantled. Valentina visited her father at the clinic every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes Saturdays too. It wasn't a formal arrangement, nor an obligation either of them had framed as such. It had simply happened, with the slightly awkward naturalness of things built after a long estrangement, things that don't yet have their own name but already carry real weight. She brought coffee from the cafe 3 blocks from the clinic, because the coffee from the machine in the hallway was, according to Aurelio, water disguised as ambition. Sometimes she also brought sketches of the design projects she was working on, having discovered that her father, whom she had always imagined as exclusively interested in numbers, contracts, and capital structures, looked at these sketches with genuine attention and asked questions that revealed a deeper understanding of space and proportion than his business history suggested. "This project," Don Aurelio said one Tuesday in the first week of December, pointing to a sketch for the renovation of a house on Paseo de los Leones that Valentina had brought that afternoon, "is for a family newly arrived from Mexico City. 3 children, they want a space that works for both working from home and family life." He paused. "It's the biggest project I've had since I started back in this." "How much is it worth?" Valentina told him the figure. Don Aurelio nodded with that innate evaluator's expression of his, which would likely never fade, even if everything else did. "It's too little," he said. "It's what the project is worth," Valentina replied, undefensively. "I know what the project is worth. I'm saying you're worth too little for this work. You charge less than you should." There was a pause. They always do at first. Then they learn that the market pays what you teach it to pay. Valentina looked at him for a second. Then, despite everything, she smiled. "Now you're going to give me business lessons." "I was always your best teacher," Don Aurelio said. "The problem is neither of us knew how to take advantage of it in time." It was that kind of conversation they had. Direct, with dry humor, the edges still a bit rough from 2 people getting to know each other again, both possessing too much character to pretend the process was easier than it was. But beneath the roughness, there was something Valentina felt with increasing clarity, a real connection. Not the idealized connection of movie reconciliations, but something more complicated and truer, the kind that arises between people who are too alike to ignore each other, and who have learned, through years and mistakes, that their resemblance was both the problem and the solution. Don Aurelio's treatment progressed, though it did not improve. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer doesn't have those clean narrative arcs, but neither was it worsening with the speed the doctors had initially feared. The oncologist in charge, a man with a calm voice and precise vocabulary named Dr. Mendoza spoke of reasonable response to treatment and stabilization window with that medical measuredness that says a lot without committing to anything definitive. Don Aurelio listened to these reports with the same attention he had given business reports his entire life, searching for the real information beneath the language, measuring what was said against what was unsaid. It was a Wednesday in mid-December when Don Aurelio asked Marco to convene a different kind of meeting, not with the directors of the Vega Group, not with Dr. Mendoza, nor with a corporate lawyer, but with just two people. His estate lawyer, Licenciado Espinoza, who had managed Don Aurelio's personal affairs for 30 years with such absolute discretion that many within the Vega Group itself were unaware of his existence. And Valentina. Valentina arrived at the clinic that Wednesday without knowing exactly what to expect. Marco had called her to ask her to come, with his usual way of conveying information without revealing context. She found her father in his armchair as always, but with the small desk moved to the center of the room and Licenciado Espinoza seated opposite him, a man of about 65, in a gray suit, with the expression of someone who has spent enough time in hospital rooms throughout his career to have developed a specific composure in the face of wealth and illness. Sit down, Don Aurelio told her. Valentina sat, looked at Licenciado Espinoza, and then at her father. What's going on? We're going to talk about the future, Don Aurelio said. What followed was a conversation of almost 2 hours that Valentina had vaguely imagined as a possibility at some point in the last few weeks, but which, now that it was happening, turned out to be simultaneously simpler and more overwhelming than she had calculated. Licenciado Espinoza presented the documents with the professional efficiency of someone who has had many such conversations and knows that clarity in these contexts is the only genuine form of respect. He explained the asset structure of the Vega Group, with its 43 companies, its holdings in Mexico and abroad, its real estate, its financial investments, its charitable trusts. He explained the succession plan that Don Aurelio had designed, and that Licenciado Espinoza had been structuring legally over the past 4 months since the diagnosis. The sole heir was Valentina, not a portion of the estate, not a generous but limited share, but everything. 87% of the controlling shares of Grupo Vega Holding, which Don Aurelio held in his name, would pass through an irrevocable trust, already established, to Valentina Vega Cisneros upon her father's death. Or, alternatively, at the moment Don Aurelio decided to enact the transfer during his lifetime, which the plan also contemplated. Valentina listened to all this with her hands on her knees and an expression that Licenciado Espinoza, in his 30 years of experience with high-net-worth families, mentally classified as unusually serene for the context. When Licenciado Espinoza finished, there was a silence. Dad, Valentina finally said, what is this? She searched for the word enormous. I know, Don Aurelio said. I don't need it. I know that too, Don Aurelio said with a patience that was new in him, that Valentina had been discovering in these weeks and suspected the illness had something to do with its appearance. But that doesn't change anything. I built Grupo Vega. It belongs to my family. You are my family. There is no one else. There are directors. There are employees. There is a daughter, Don Aurelio interrupted her. And the rest are people who work for the company. That's not the same. Valentina looked at her father's face for a moment, at those dark eyes untouched by time, at the large, gnarled hands resting on the desk, at the still erect posture of a man refusing to yield ground, even if his body no longer always responded as it had before. She found something she hadn't consciously sought, but recognized, the expression of a man who has reached that point in life where he no longer has time to do things indirectly. Do you know what this means? Valentina asked. Managing all of this, the companies, the directors, the decisions. I know perfectly well, Don Aurelio said. And I know you can too. I took too long to recognize it, but I know you. Valentina looked toward the window. The orange trees in the garden that December afternoon bore fruit, small, round, of a saturation of orange so deep they seemed painted. She had ignored them every previous time she had been in that room. Now she saw them. Why now? She asked. Why not wait? Don Aurelio took time to answer. It was a pause that held within it the specific weight of things proud men do not say until they have no other option. Because I waited too long, he finally said with everything. I waited too long to call you. I waited too long to ask for your forgiveness. I waited too long to tell you what you were worth, when I could still have protected you from people who didn't know. A longer pause. I no longer have time to keep waiting for the right moment. Licenciado Espinoza discreetly glanced at his documents with that knack he had for becoming invisible, when the conversation shifted from the legal to the human plane. Valentina didn't answer immediately. She felt something in her chest that was complicated to name, because it was several things at once. Gratitude and sadness, and something that resembled pain, but wasn't exactly pain, but rather the sharp awareness of time that doesn't return, of years wasted in silence on both sides, of all that could have been different if they had both been less of who they were, less proud, less sure of being right, less alike in precisely the ways that had kept them apart. Dad, Valentina said, I have to tell you something. Don Aurelio waited for you. What you did with Rodrigo caused a pause. I didn't ask you to. I know, and I'm not sure it was right to do so. Don Aurelio looked at her for a moment with that direct gaze. I'm sure, he said. You're always sure of everything. Of almost everything, replied Don Aurelio. Of some mistakes, I wasn't sure until it was too late to fix them. A pause. But of this, yes. A man who tells my daughter that without his surname she is nobody deserves to learn what that statement cost him. I don't regret that. Valentina looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, not in a way that meant approval, exactly, but in a way that meant understanding. That she understood where that decision came from. What kind of love, complicated, late, expressed in the only language that man had learned to speak over 81 years of life, had motivated him. I want you to know, Don Aurelio said, his voice dropping a bit, losing some of its concrete hardness and gaining something different, that the years I didn't call were the hardest of my life, not because business was bad, but because every night, before sleeping, I thought that I had a daughter somewhere in this city and that I was choosing pride over calling her. Valentina looked at him. Why are you telling me now? Because if I don't tell you now, Don Aurelio replied, I don't know when I'll have another chance. It was the first time in all the years Valentina could remember that her father had used those kinds of words. Not as a declaration of strategic vulnerability, not as a negotiating gambit, but as what they were. Simple truth, told on time, with all the difficulty it cost him to say. Valentina got up from the armchair where she had been sitting, walked over to where her father was, and knelt beside his armchair. Not theatrically, but with the naturalness of someone who needs to be at the same height as another person to tell them what they have to say. And she placed her hand on her father's large knobby hand. Don Aurelio looked at her. In his dark eyes, eyes that time hadn't touched, there was something Valentina had never seen in them. Moisture, not tears, exactly. That state before tears that people's eyes have when they learned very early that crying was a luxury they couldn't afford, and never entirely unlearned. Me too? Valentina said in a very low voice. 2 words, but the 2 correct words said at the right moment, with her hand on his, in a room that smelled of gardenias and coffee, and of the orange trees in the garden, which had fruits so saturated a shade of orange they looked painted. Licenciado Espinoza, with his 30 years of discretion, closed his folder, stood up silently, and walked into the hallway. He left them alone. The father and daughter, the time that had gone, and the time that still remained, and outside the window, the orange trees in the Santa Lucia Clinic garden, still and full of fruit under the December light. The last chapter January arrived in Monterrey with a dry, clear cold that made the mountains look sharper than ever, as if winter had cleaned their contours with the precision of a razor. It was the kind of cold that doesn't paralyze but awakens, that puts things on alert, that gives the air a particular taste, clean, without false promises, honest as beginnings are, when one doesn't over-decorate them. The first Monday of January at 9 a.m., Valentina Vega Cisneros entered the corporate building of the Vega Group for the first time. Not as a visitor, not as the founder's daughter on a sentimental tour. She entered with the folder of documents that Licenciado Espinosa had prepared over the last 3 weeks. The notarized powers of attorney, the minutes of the meetings, the records of the stock transfers that Don Aurelio had decided to make effective before the end of the year, while he could still do it himself with his own hands, without leaving it for a moment, he could no longer control. The corporate building of Grupo Vega was in a discreet business district of San Pedro, Garza, Garcia, a construction of gray quarry stone and glass that didn't aim to impress from the outside, but which inside had that specific solidity of places built to last, not to show off. Marco Villanueva was waiting for her at reception. He greeted her with the affectionate efficiency he had developed over 15 years of working for her father, and which Valentina suspected would be one of her most valuable assets in the coming months. "Good morning, Miss Vega," Marco said. "Good morning, Marco." A pause. "You can call me Valentina." Marco nodded. He didn't say yes or no. He was a man who knew that certain instructions are assimilated and applied without the need for verbal confirmation. The meeting with the group's directors was scheduled for 10 a.m. Valentina had an hour. She used it to walk through the building with Marco, who guided her with his narrative efficiency, precise data, just the right context, without excess. Through each area, each division, each space that had been the heart of what her father had built for 58 years, it was overwhelming. It would have been dishonest to say otherwise. It was the kind of overwhelming that has less to do with fear and more with the sudden understanding of the scale of things. How many people depended on that building and on what was decided within it? How many families, how many chains of consequences? It was a responsibility of a size that isn't measured in the abstract, but is only felt when one is standing in its physical center. Valentina felt it and didn't push it away. The meeting with the directors was, as she expected, a delicate balance between the new and the established. There were 12 people around the boardroom table, men and women between 40 and 60 years old, all with years of experience in the group, all with the understandable mix of loyalty to the founder, uncertainty about what was coming, and the inevitable assessment of who this woman was who now held 8%. Valentina didn't arrive with a prepared speech. She arrived with questions. She asked about ongoing projects, about the year's priorities, about the most delicate contracts, about the markets where the group had a presence, and those it had yet to explore. She asked with the attention of someone who genuinely listens, without the urgency to prove she already knows, without the insecurity of someone who needs to impress. She took notes. When she didn't understand something, she said so. When she was given information that contradicted something she had reviewed in the previous documents, she pointed it out with precision and without aggression. At the end of the meeting, the operations director, a man named Castillo, who had been with the group for 22 years and had a reputation for being the hardest to convince of any position, said to Marco in a low voice as they left, "She's his daughter, no doubt." Marco didn't answer, but he didn't contradict him either. Don Aurelio wasn't at that meeting. He was at the clinic most days that January, undergoing treatment with the discipline of a man who had decided he would use the time he had left with the same efficiency he had used everything else. But that afternoon, when Valentina went to visit him with coffee from the 3-block-away cafe, she told him everything. The meeting, the directors, the questions she had asked, and those she still had pending. Don Aurelio listened with his eyes closed. Valentina, who knew him well enough by now to know that closed eyes didn't mean he wasn't paying attention, but quite the opposite, continued talking. When she finished, Don Aurelio opened his eyes. "And Castillo?" he asked. "Difficult?" Valentina said, "but honest. I think I can work with him." "He's the best you have," Don Aurelio said. "Don't lose him." "I won't lose him." Don Aurelio nodded once, and in that nod there was something Valentina recognized because it was new. It wasn't the nod of someone approving. It was the nod of someone trusting. They were two completely different things. Meanwhile, at the other end of the city, Rodrigo Montiel was going through the consequences of what November and December had left behind. Montiel Industries hadn't collapsed. It was a company with enough history not to collapse from a difficult quarter, but it had suffered a significant contraction. The sale of the Saltillo plant to generate liquidity, the renegotiation of debt with 3 banks, the departure of 2 of the investment fund partners under conditions that had favored them more than Rodrigo. The company was surviving, but it had shrunk. And Rodrigo, who had built his identity on the permanent expansion of what he owned, discovered that shrinkage has a specific taste that resembles nothing he had experienced before. Isabela Fuentes Cardenas, the woman in the red dress from the gala, had disappeared from the scene with the silent efficiency with which certain people disappear when the circumstances that attracted them changed direction. There was no drama, no scene, simply one day the calls were shorter, and then there were fewer, and then there were none. Rodrigo processed it alone in his new apartment, smaller than the house in San Pedro, because the house in San Pedro was in the process of being sold to contribute to liquidity, with that specific loneliness of men who have built their world around the power they exercise over others and discover, when that power diminishes, that they don't know exactly what remains beneath. The last resort arrived in February. Rodrigo showed up at the corporate building of the Vega Group on a Tuesday at 11 a.m. without an appointment. He told the receptionist he needed to see Valentina Vega. The receptionist made him wait with perfect courtesy for 15 minutes. After which Marco came out to the lobby with that expression of amiable efficiency. "Miss Vega has a full agenda this morning," Marco said. "May I schedule an appointment for you for next week if you indicate the reason for the meeting?" "The reason," Rodrigo said, "is personal." "I understand," Marco said. "Would you like to leave a message?" Rodrigo looked at him for a second. He looked at the lobby of Grupo Vega with its gray quarry stone and discreet solidity, the bronze plaque by the elevator that said Grupo Vega, founded 1966. He looked at the receptionist typing on her computer with the trained indifference of someone who doesn't register what isn't her business to register. He looked at Marco, who waited with a patience that wasn't condescending, but simply infinite. And then Valentina appeared in the lobby. She was coming from the elevator with a folder under her arm and her phone in her hand, talking to someone, telling them that the 2 o'clock meeting was confirmed. She saw Rodrigo when he was already several steps into the lobby, and didn't hesitate, didn't change her pace. He ended his sentence on the phone. "Yes, 2 o'clock, perfect," and he hung up. She looked at him. Rodrigo looked at her. She wore a navy blue tailored suit, her hair pulled back, small gold earrings. She looked exactly the same as always, and completely different. There was something in her posture that wasn't the dress or the styling, but something more internal and permanent, something built when a person occupies their rightful space and does so from within, not from anyone's permission. Rodrigo spoke with the same neutrality as on the day of the Cumbres apartment. Valentina paused. It was clear she had prepared something to say, and that now, facing her in that lobby, the words carried a different weight than when she had first thought them. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" "About the company, about possible collaboration. We have manufacturing lines that could complement each other." He stopped, looked at the floor for a moment, and then did something that was perhaps the hardest thing he had done in a long time. He stopped speaking the language of business. "Valentina, I've come to ask you to listen to me." Valentina studied him for a moment. On her face there was no triumph, no satisfaction, none of the feelings that revenge stories often portray at such moments, because revenge stories don't always understand that real life has more complicated and honest emotions than triumph. Instead, there was the expression of a woman who had reached a place of clarity about what she had, what she wanted, and what she had no interest in occupying her time and attention with. Marco, Valentina said, her eyes not leaving Rodrigo. Yes, Marco replied from his discreet position by the elevator. I have something before too. You have a call with the director of Northern Steel at 1:30, Marco said. And Licenciado Espinoza is waiting for the signatures on the San Luis subsidiary documents sometime this morning. Perfect. Valentina looked at Rodrigo. I have until 1. Come with me. And she walked towards the small meeting room next to the lobby, the one they used for visitors who didn't go up to the executive floor. Rodrigo followed her. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Valentina listened, asked questions, took notes in a small notebook, with the same attention she had given to notes from meetings with the group directors. In the end, she said she would evaluate it, that if there was anything viable, she would pass it to the corresponding team, and that they should tell their commercial department to send the formal proposal through the regular channels. Nothing more, nothing less. Rodrigo left the Vega Group building at 12:15. He got into his car, the driver, the same one as always, who had been driving him for 8 years, and who, in those 8 years, had learned to read his boss's silences more accurately than many direct collaborators. He looked at him in the rearview mirror and asked nothing. The car started, and Rodrigo Montiel, on his way to his office in Torre Gomez, had for the first time in a long time the clear and uncomfortable sensation of having been in a room with someone bigger than him, not in terms of money or power, though in those terms too, but in the most basic and hardest to ignore sense. Someone who occupied their space from within and needed no one's approval to justify it. It was the sensation Valentina must have felt many times during their marriage, watching him try to diminish her, only he had noticed it too late. That same afternoon, at 5 o'clock, Valentina went to the clinic with her usual coffee. Don Aurelio was in his armchair. He had the color of a good day. The treatment had its irregular rhythms, days of more energy alternating with days of less, and he had been reading a financial report on his lap. But he had closed it when he heard footsteps in the corridor. Valentina entered, placed the coffee on the small table, and sat down opposite him. It was Rodrigo today, she said. I know, said Don Aurelio. Marco kept him informed of everything that happened in the building. I told him to send the proposal through formal channels. Don Aurelio looked at her. And are you going to review it? Valentina thought for a second. If it makes commercial sense, yes, she said. If it doesn't, no. A pause. I'm not going to do business with him to punish him, nor am I going to stop doing business to punish him either. I'm going to do what makes sense for the group. Don Aurelio nodded. This time the nod was slower, more deliberate. He had something inside him that, in another man, might have been called pride, but in Don Aurelio, it was something slightly different. The specific recognition of someone who sees in another person, the improved version of what he himself had tried to be. Good, said Don Aurelio Vega Cisneros. It was the third time he had used that word in that context, and it was, like the previous two, more than a comment. It was a declaration. Valentina took her coffee. Don Aurelio took his. Outside, the Santa Lucia Clinic's garden had orange trees full of fruit, and the wrought iron bench that no one used, and the January sky over the Sierra, so blue and so clear it looked painted. They talked for an hour about the project directors for the year, about a decision Valentina wanted to make regarding the logistics division, and wanted to hear if Don Aurelio had ever considered it. Don Aurelio listened, asked questions, gave his opinion when she asked for it, and didn't give it when she didn't, a new distinction in him that Valentina noticed and appreciated without saying it. As the afternoon darkened into that deep January blue that arrives early in Monterey, Valentina stood to say goodbye. Don Aurelio looked at her from his armchair. Valentina, he said. What? Are you okay? It was a small question. 3 words of the kind men like Don Aurelio rarely formulate, because they rarely know how to do it without sounding like something they're not. But he said it with that voice that now had a permanent crack, and that Valentina had learned to hear not as weakness, but as what it was. The voice of a man who had decided he had too little time left to keep holding back the questions that mattered. Valentina looked at him for a moment. She thought of the October courthouse, of the black pen on white paper. She thought of the Cumbres apartment, and its plans and its sketches. She thought of the Vega Group lobby that morning with the folder under his arm and the phone in his hand, and Rodrigo Montiel looking at her from across the lobby, like something he could no longer completely grasp. She thought of her father in that armchair with his dark eyes untouched by time, asking if she was okay. Yes, said Valentina, and it was true. Not the truth of someone who says they're fine because it's what's expected, but the more complicated and solid truth of someone who, after a long and not always clean path, has arrived at a place she recognizes as her own. Good, said Don Aurelio, and Valentina Vega Cisneros left room 214 of the Santa Lucia Clinic. She descended the light gray carpeted stairs, crossed the lobby with its eternal gardenias, and pushed the door out into the January night, which smelled of cold and earth, and of something that didn't yet have a name, but was already beginning. What remained behind was what had been. What lay ahead had no defined form yet, but it was hers, all hers. And that is what Valentina discovered as she walked to her car under the dark Monterey sky with the Sierra in the background, as it always was, exactly enough. The end.